I was dying, and they knew it, but they didn't care. I lay in my hospital bed, my body weak, my breath shallow. I had been fighting for months, waiting for the surgery that would save my life, waiting for the money that had already been promised to me, waiting for my family to prove that I mattered. But that night I learned the truth that destroyed me. I heard them talking outside my room. Their voices were low, hushed, but I heard every word, every syllable that shattered my world. She'll survive. My father's voice, cold, dismissive. The surgery isn't urgent. She's young. She'll be fine. Then my mother sighing. And this honeymoon is important for her. She deserves it. Her. My sister. The golden child. The one who had always been their priority. And now she was the one who would receive my surgery money, because her happiness was more important than my life. I clutched the blanket, my fingers trembling. I wanted to scream, to burst out of the room and confront them, to beg them to choose me just this once. But I didn't, because I already knew. It wouldn't change anything. The next morning they came into my room, smiling, pretending, acting like they still loved me. I stayed silent, because I knew the truth now, and it was suffocating. My mother sat beside me, stroking my hair. "We talked to the doctors," she said softly. "They said the surgery can wait." I clenched my fists beneath the blanket. I already knew what she would say next. I had already heard them make the decision. "The money will go to your sister instead." But when she said it out loud, when she actually looked me in the eyes and discarded me like I was nothing, something inside me broke. I forced my voice to stay even. "Her honeymoon is more important than my life?" My father sighed, annoyed. "Don't be selfish," he snapped. "She just got married. This is her moment." I wanted to laugh. Selfish? I was selfish for wanting to live? For wanting to be saved? They left soon after. Not in anger. Not in guilt. But because they had better things to do. A daughter who actually mattered. A honeymoon to prepare for. And I was just an afterthought. I was supposed to die. They expected me to die. A slow, quiet, inevitable death. And maybe I would have. Maybe I would have let the sickness take me. But something inside me refused to break. Because if they wanted me gone, I would do the exact opposite. I would live. I would survive. And one day, I would make them regret every single thing they had done to me. The next few months were a battle. I fought for my life alone. Without their money. Without their help. Without their love. I reached out to everyone except them. I found a way. A stranger's kindness. A miracle I never expected. And against all odds, I survived. I recovered. I came back stronger. But I didn't go to them. Not yet. Because if they thought I was still weak, if they thought I was still helpless, desperate, and dying, then I could destroy them without them even seeing it coming. The day my sister returned from her honeymoon, I visited my family. I stood at their doorstep, knocking lightly. My mother opened the door, blinking in surprise. "Oh," she said, like she had forgotten I existed. I smiled. A soft, weak, harmless smile. "Can I come in?" I sat with them at the dining table. The same table where, months ago, they had chosen her over me. The same table where they had discarded me. My father looked me over, frowning. "You look better," he said. I nodded. "The doctors say I was lucky." A lie. I hadn't been lucky. I had been stronger than they expected. I had been more determined than they ever gave me credit for. But I let them believe it. Because if they thought I was still weak, then they wouldn't see what was coming next. My sister arrived moments later. Still glowing from her trip. Still the perfect daughter they adored. She smiled when she saw me. "Welcome back," she said sweetly. Like she hadn't just stolen my chance at survival. Like she hadn't celebrated while I was supposed to be dying. And I smiled back. Because the game had begun. That night, as they all laughed and talked, I stayed quiet. Watching. Studying. Learning everything I needed to know. Because they thought I was back to rebuild my place in the family. They thought I had returned to beg for their love again. But I hadn't. I had returned to take everything from them. The same way they had taken everything from me. I stood, excusing myself early. As I reached for my coat, my father spoke. "You should be grateful," he said lightly. I turned to him, tilting my head. For what? He sipped his drink, completely unbothered. For giving you the chance to grow on your own, he said. If we had wasted money on that surgery, you wouldn't have learned how to fight for yourself. I stared at him, at the man who had left me to die. And I smiled. You're right, I murmured. His lips curled into a smug grin. I reached for the door handle, pausing just before stepping out. Then in the softest whisper I said, and soon you'll learn what it feels like to lose everything too. His grin faltered. I walked out, leaving the first crack in his perfect world. Because the war had just begun. They thought I had forgiven them, that I had returned to rebuild our broken bond, that I was still the weak, desperate daughter who needed their love. But they didn't know. I wasn't back to be part of their family. I was back to destroy it. I played my role perfectly, smiling when my mother asked how I had recovered, laughing when my father made dismissive comments about how I had become independent thanks to them, acting like I was grateful for the suffering they had put me through. And my sister? She sat across from me at every meal, her life still perfect. Her expensive clothes, her diamond ring, her luxurious gifts from the money that should have saved me. She thought she was still the golden child. She thought I was still beneath her. But soon, she would learn what it felt like to lose everything. The first real move came when I started gaining their trust again. Not because I needed it, but because trust makes people blind. And blind people walk straight into traps. I let my mother take me shopping, pretending to admire the things I couldn't afford. I let my father lecture me about resilience, nodding as if his words held any value. I let my sister boast about her luxurious life, smiling as if I wasn't already planning her downfall. And little by little, they started to let their guard down, because they thought I was weak again. And that was exactly what I wanted. One evening, my mother sighed dramatically over dinner. We should do something nice for your sister, she said, glancing at my father. She's had such a stressful few months after the wedding. My father hummed in agreement. You're right. Maybe another vacation. Another vacation. With money they didn't deserve. With wealth built on my suffering. I swallowed back my rage, keeping my expression soft. That sounds lovely, I said, voice gentle. They smiled. Satisfied. Because they thought I had accepted my place in this family again. They thought I had forgiven them. But they didn't know that their downfall had already begun. The first public crack appeared 2 weeks later. A small rumor. A tiny leak of information. Just enough to plant the first seed of doubt. A subtle mention in a social circle about how my parents had stolen money from their own daughter. A whisper about how they had abandoned me when I needed them most. A carefully placed comment in front of the right people. Nothing too big. Nothing obvious. But just enough to make people start asking questions. Because once the whispers begin, they never stop. At first my parents didn't notice. They were too busy enjoying their stolen happiness. But my sister? She felt it first. She sensed something was off. I could see it in the way her smile wasn't as confident. In the way she started paying more attention to the way people looked at her. In the way her perfect world felt just a little less perfect. And she hated it. Because she had never tasted failure before. She had never felt insecurity. But this was only the beginning. One afternoon she cornered me in the hallway. Her arms crossed. Her expression sharp. You've been acting strange, she said, studying me. I tilted my head. How so? She narrowed her eyes. You're too calm. I laughed softly. I can't be happy. She didn't smile back. She knew me too well. She knew something had changed. And I could see it in her eyes. She was starting to suspect. Good. Let her. Because knowing something is wrong, and being able to stop it, are two very different things. The first real damage came 3 days later. A high society event. A gathering where my family was supposed to shine. Where my father was respected. Where my sister was admired. And that's where I delivered my first true strike. The whispers that had been slowly building behind closed doors, they finally broke into the open. Someone, a woman who had once been a close family friend, made an offhand remark, loud enough for others to hear. I heard a rather shocking story recently, she said, sipping her wine. My sister stiffened beside me. Oh, Someone asked. The woman nodded. About a girl who was abandoned when she was sick, left to suffer while her family enjoyed luxury. Silence fell over the group. And my sister? She went pale. Her eyes darted to me. She knew. She knew I was the one who had started the whispers. She knew her perfect image was beginning to crack. But she couldn't say anything. Because the moment she opened her mouth, she would be admitting her own guilt. And so she stayed quiet. And the whispers spread. And just like that, her downfall had begun. That night she stormed into my room. You did this, she hissed. I looked up from my book, feigning innocence. Did what? Her hands clenched into fists. People are talking about us. I smiled. Are they? Her breath hitched. She knew. She knew I was playing a game. But she didn't know the rules. And that was already a victory. She exhaled sharply, forcing herself to calm down. I don't know what you're trying to do, she whispered. I closed my book, meeting her gaze. I'm just living my life. Her jaw tightened. Stay out of my way. I smiled wider. But sister, I said sweetly, tilting my head. I never got in your way. You were always the one standing in mine. Her lips parted slightly. For the first time she had no response. And I had never felt more powerful. The next morning my parents called me downstairs. My father looked annoyed. My mother looked uneasy. They had heard the whispers. They had felt the shift. And now, they wanted answers. I sat across from them, sipping my tea, pretending to be clueless. My father sighed, rubbing his temples. There are some rumors spreading about us. I raised an eyebrow. Rumors. My mother's voice was softer. People are talking about the past. I hummed. Isn't the past the past? My father scowled. You know what I mean. I set my cup down carefully. I don't understand, I said, tilting my head. Why would anyone talk about that? His jaw clenched. That's what we need to find out. I smiled. Because he still didn't know. He still didn't realize that I was the one holding the match. And soon, I would burn everything they had built. She was cracking. I could see it in the way her smile never quite reached her eyes anymore. In the way she watched people too closely at social events. In the way she flinched whenever my name was mentioned. She knew. She knew her perfect life was no longer perfect. But she didn't know how to stop it. And that was the most satisfying part. The whispers had grown louder. What started as small rumors was now public conversation. People were talking. People were questioning. People were looking at my family differently. And in our world, reputation was everything. And once it starts to crumble, there is no putting it back together. My parents noticed it too. My father's expression had become permanently strained. My mother had grown restless, anxious, constantly watching. And my sister? She was desperate. Because for the first time, she wasn't admired. She wasn't envied. She wasn't loved. She was questioned. And for someone like her, that was worse than anything. The first real public embarrassment came at a prestigious charity gala. The kind of event where only the most elite attended. Where image was everything. And where, for the first time, my sister would taste what it felt like to be truly humiliated. It started with an innocent question. A wealthy businesswoman, known for her sharp mind and sharper tongue, smiled politely at my sister. You must be so lucky, she said smoothly. My sister blinked, confused. Lucky. The woman sipped her wine. To have such a generous family. The air shifted. My father's posture stiffened. My mother let out a nervous laugh. And my sister? She froze. The woman tilted her head, playing innocent. After all, not every family would choose their daughter's happiness over another's life. Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. Then the murmurs started. My sister's eyes darted to me. Because she knew. She knew I had planted the seed. She knew I had let it grow. And now, she was watching it bloom in front of her. Because there was no denying it anymore.
No pretending.
No escaping the truth. Everyone knew. And that was the beginning of her downfall. After that night, things got worse. Her once loyal friends started keeping their distance. The social invitations became fewer and fewer. The admiration she once bathed in had turned into quiet judgment. And she was drowning in it, because she had never known what it felt like to be the one on the outside. But now, she was the one watching as the doors shut in her face. She tried to fix it. Of course she did. She denied the rumors, laughed them off, said people were misunderstanding the situation. But the problem with lies? Once people see through them, they don't believe anything you say. And the problem with being on top? The higher you stand, the harder you fall. And she was falling fast. 2 weeks later, she finally cracked. She stormed into my room late at night. Her hair was messy. Her makeup was smudged. She didn't look like the perfect sister anymore. She looked desperate. Her voice shook with anger. "What did you do?" I glanced up from my book, pretending to be confused. "Do." She slammed her hands on the desk. "Don't act innocent with me." I smiled. "But I am innocent." Her breath hitched. Her fingers clenched. Her control? Gone. I leaned back, tilting my head. "Why are you so upset, sister?" Her jaw tightened. "You know why." I sighed dramatically. "Is it because people are finally seeing you for who you really are?" She flinched. "Good. Let her feel it. Let her feel the same helplessness she once made me feel. Because this was just the beginning." She let out a sharp breath, trying to regain control. "We are family," she whispered. I laughed. Cold. Sharp. Unforgiving. "Were we family when you let them take my surgery money?" She stilled. I stood slowly, taking my time. Then, in a voice so soft it made her shudder, I whispered, "Did you ever think about me while you were enjoying your honeymoon?" She swallowed hard. I smiled. "I thought about you," I whispered. Her breath caught. I leaned closer. "I thought about you every day I lay in that hospital bed." She staggered back. Because she knew. She knew there was no coming back from this. And for the first time in her life, she was truly completely powerless. She tried one last time. Her voice was small now, almost pleading. "You've made your point." I tilted my head. "Oh, sister," I whispered. "You have no idea how much further this will go." Her eyes widened, because she finally understood. This wasn't about ruining her reputation. This was about taking everything. The way she had taken everything from me. And this was only the beginning. She left my room in silence. And I smiled to myself, because I had won the first battle. But the war was far from over. She was unraveling. And now, it was their turn. My parents had always believed in control. They dictated everything. Where I went, what I did, who I became. And when I was no longer convenient, they discarded me. But the problem with throwing someone away? You never expect them to come back stronger. And now they were starting to panic. Because everything they built was crumbling. And the worst part? They had no idea who was holding the hammer. The first real sign of their fear came one morning at breakfast. My father sat at the head of the table, his expression tight. My mother kept glancing at me, as if waiting for something. And my sister? She didn't speak at all. She just sat there, hands clenched in her lap. Because she knew. She knew what I was doing. She just didn't know how to stop me. Finally, my father sighed, setting his cup down. "There are rumors," he said carefully. I took a bite of my toast. "Oh." He narrowed his eyes. "People are talking about our family." I blinked. "How interesting." My mother exhaled sharply. "This isn't funny." I tilted my head, smiling. I didn't say it was. The tension grew thick. My father straightened. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about these rumors, would you?" I sipped my tea, letting the warmth spread through me. Then I met his gaze. Calm. Collected. And said, "Why would I?" My sister let out a shaky breath. She was the only one in the room who truly knew. Who understood that I wasn't the same daughter they had abandoned. But she couldn't prove anything. She had no evidence. No power. Nothing. And that was what made it even more satisfying. Because now they were the ones living in uncertainty. Waiting. Wondering. Fearing. And soon, they would lose everything. The second major blow came when one of my father's closest allies turned against him. A business partner. Someone who had once respected him. Someone who had once believed in him. But now Now they saw him for who he really was. A man who had betrayed his own child. A man who had put wealth over blood. And in our world, loyalty meant everything. And once you lose it, you never get it back. The betrayal happened in public. At a high-profile event. An elegant gathering filled with the most powerful names in society. Where my father should have stood tall. Where my mother should have been admired. Where my sister should have been envied. But instead, they were humiliated. It started when a well-known businessman, one my father had relied on for years, walked past him without a word. A deliberate act. A clear statement. And the people in the room? They noticed. The murmurs spread like wildfire. Because when someone like my father is publicly ignored, it means something is very, very wrong. I watched from across the room, swirling my wine, savoring it, enjoying it, because he still didn't know why this was happening, didn't know who had planted the seed, didn't know that his own daughter had set this trap months ago. And that was the most beautiful part. Watching him realize too late. Watching him struggle to fix something that was already broken. Watching him fall. The moment got worse when a second ally, one even closer than the first, spoke publicly. Loud enough for people to hear. I don't do business with men who betray their own blood. My father's face drained of color. The entire room went silent. And just like that, his reputation collapsed. I caught my sister's gaze from across the room. She knew this was my doing. But she couldn't say anything. Because what was she going to tell them? That her weak, helpless sister wasn't weak or helpless anymore. That the girl she had abandoned was now more powerful than all of them? She had no proof.
No habláis.
Nothing. And I was just getting started. That night, my father locked himself in his study. My mother was in hysterics. And my sister? She didn't come home at all. Because she couldn't face what was happening. Couldn't handle the reality of her world collapsing. And me? I slept peacefully. Because soon, they would lose everything. And I would finally walk away. Forever. They were falling apart. And this time, there was no saving them. My father's empire was crumbling. The once loyal business partners? Gone. The investors who once trusted him blindly? Pulling out. The reputation he had spent years building? Destroyed in a matter of days. And the worst part? He had no idea how it happened. My mother was no better. Her social circle had abandoned her. The once friendly invitations? Gone. The admiration she had bathed in for years? Turned into whispers behind her back. And my sister? She was drowning. Her perfect world was falling apart piece by piece. And she couldn't stop it. Because she still didn't understand. Still didn't know how I had done it. And now it was too late. The final blow came when my father lost everything. His company, taken from him. His wealth, frozen. His influence, gone. The very people who once shook his hand with admiration, now wouldn't even return his calls. Because in our world, once you fall, you never rise again. And he had finally fallen. The first real moment of desperation came late one evening. I was sitting in my office reviewing the final stages of my plan. When the call came, my mother's voice was shaky. "Please," she whispered. "Come home." I leaned back in my chair, tilting my head. Home. I smiled. I don't have a home there. Silence. A sharp inhale. Then a broken sob. I hung up. Because her pain wasn't my problem anymore. The next day, I visited the estate. Not because I wanted to. Not because I cared. But because I wanted to see them break. I wanted to see the ruins of the world they had once ruled. I wanted to see them finally understand what it felt like to be powerless. Because that was true justice. The house was different. No more expensive cars lined the driveway. No more lavish decorations. No more arrogant perfection. It was empty. Like the people inside had already died. My mother opened the door. She looked tired. Older. Like the weight of their own betrayal had finally settled on her shoulders. She forced a smile. "Darling," she said weakly. I tilted my head. "How does it feel?" I asked softly. Her smile faltered. I stepped inside. Because this was the moment I had waited for. And I was going to savor it. My father was sitting in the living room. Not the proud, powerful man he once was. Now, he looked small, defeated, like he had finally understood what it meant to lose. Good, because he deserved it. He cleared his throat when he saw me. You did this. I smiled. Oh, you finally figured it out? His jaw clenched. My mother shifted uncomfortably. We are still your family, she whispered. I laughed. Loud, sharp, unforgiving. You stopped being my family the moment you left me to die. My sister finally appeared, stepping into the room. She was a mess. Hair unkempt. Eyes red. Her usual perfect exterior? Shattered. And when she saw me, when she realized I had come to witness her suffering, she broke. Her voice was hoarse. You ruined me. I tilted my head. Did I? She shook with anger. You took everything. I smiled.
No, iwis parat.
I just returned the favor. She staggered forward. What do you want? She choked out. An apology? I laughed again. Low, amused. No, I said. I just wanted to see you like this. Her breath hitched, because she finally understood. This wasn't about fixing things. This wasn't about rebuilding what they had destroyed. This was about making sure they never recovered. And now, they never would. My father exhaled sharply. What now? I looked at him, truly looked at him. The man who had chosen wealth over blood. The man who had discarded me like nothing. The man who had expected me to die quietly. And I smiled. You figure that out on your own. His face paled, because for the first time, he realized I wasn't here to save them. I was here to watch them drown. I turned toward the door, stepping away from the ruins of my past. My mother let out a sob. My sister collapsed onto the couch, shaking. And my father, he just sat there, silent, because he knew this was his punishment, and there was no escaping it. I paused at the doorway, looked back one last time, and in the softest, most final whisper I said, You should have chosen the right daughter. Then I walked away. And this time, I never looked back. I walked away from them, from the house that had once been mine, from the family that had once been my whole world, from the people who had left me for dead. And I had never felt more alive. The moment I stepped outside, I inhaled deeply. The night air was crisp, refreshing, a reminder that I was no longer suffocating under their control, that I had won, and they had lost everything. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel regret, because they had never hesitated to abandon me. They had watched me suffer. They had let me rot. And now it was their turn. To be discarded, to be forgotten, to live knowing they had destroyed themselves. Days passed, then weeks. The whispers never stopped. My father's fall from grace had become a permanent stain. No one wanted to be associated with a man who betrayed his own blood. My mother, her once admired status was erased overnight. No more invitations, no more power, just a fading memory of the woman she used to be. And my sister? She had become a cautionary tale. No one envied her anymore. No one wanted to be her, because she was nothing now. One evening I sat in my office, watching the city lights flicker below. This was my world now, my success, my power, and they had no place in it. Not anymore. Not ever again. I received a letter that night. No return address. But I recognized the handwriting immediately. My mother's. For a moment, I just stared at it. Then finally, I opened it. We were wrong. We should have chosen you. But now we live with the consequences of our choices. And you. You don't even think about us anymore, do you? I folded the letter carefully. Then, without hesitation, I burned it. I watched the flames consume their words, their regrets, their desperate attempt to fix what could never be fixed. And when the last ember turned to ash, I turned away, because I had no more time for ghosts, no more time for the people who had tried to bury me, no more time for a family that had never truly been mine, because this was my life now. And them? They were nothing but a lesson I would never forget. Years passed. Time moved forward. I moved forward. The scars they left behind faded. The memories became distant, like an old story I had once known but no longer cared for. And them? They became irrelevant. Not a thought. Not a whisper. Not even a shadow. Just a mistake I would never make again. One night I walked along the shoreline, the waves crashing softly against the sand. I glanced at the world around me,